this video is talking about directional terms. So directional terms are used to describe the position of structures relative to other structures within the body. Alright guys, so for directional terms, we first have to start off in standard anatomical position. Standard anatomical position is that upright, palms out position, and we're gonna side this little model real quick so we have the right side and the left side. So when I think about directional terms, I like to think of them in opposites. So we're gonna start off with superior, which is also thought of as the above term, and inferior, which is thought of as the below term. These two usually go hand in hand. So I'm going to show you this nice little picture with some arrows and give you an example. So the heart is superior to the diaphragm in the same way that the diaphragm is inferior to the heart. It's important that we learn these directional terms and get comfortable using them because they're representative, and it makes talking about the body so much easier. So one more time, the heart is superior to the diaphragm in the same way that the diaphragm is inferior to the heart. Next up, we have medial and lateral. So medial means that it's towards the midline. So if we were to draw a line directly down the middle of your body, that's the most medial you can get. And lateral is directly the opposite of that, so away from or further away from the midline. I have a very similar picture here. It shows the closer you get to the midline, you are more medial, and the further away from you get from the midline, you're more lateral. So in this example, I use the heart and lungs. So the heart is more medial than the lungs. It's because the heart sits closer to the midline than the lungs do. In that same case, the lungs are lateral, more lateral than the heart, because they sit further away from that midline. Next up, we have proximal and distal. So these are discussing the appendages, so the arms and the legs, and it uses these words to describe if they're closer in the terms of proximal, or further away in the term of distal to the point of attachment. So the point of attachment would be the shoulder or the hip. So POA stands for point of attachment here. So proximal is closer to that shoulder in this example. So the arm is proximal to the forearm in the same way that the thigh would be proximal to the leg. And the opposite can be said for distal. So the forearm is distal to the arm in the same way that the leg is distal to the thigh. Next up, we have anterior and posterior. So anterior is closer to the front, while posterior is, you can think of it as behind. I always kind of think like posterior can be a term for like your buttocks. Here, I'm going to use the heart and the sternum as the example. And so the heart sits posterior to the sternum. That's because it sits closer to the back of the body than the sternum does. And the opposite is true. The sternum is anterior to the heart. So the sternum sits closer to the front of the body than the heart does. Okay, and last but not least, we have superficial and deep. I don't have another picture for these, but you get into the integumentary system, or you will soon, and I think that's a really good example. So superficial is if you're closer to the outside, versus deep is if you're closer to the inside. I like to think of it as like deeper inside of yourself. So a good example is the epidermis is superficial to the dermis.